Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Cross Country Super Podcast. And this episode is proudly brought to you by Zaga, generating stable, fixed income style returns with an investor-first approach. Why zig when you can Zaga? And of course, as usual, joining me today is the lovely Jemma Sanderson, all the way from Perth. How are you, Jemma?
I'm well, thanks, Darin. How are you?
That's good. I'm pretty well, thanks. I'm pretty well. Now, today we're going to discuss overseas pension schemes. And basically, if you've contributed to a pension scheme overseas, but you've moved back to Australia now after having been employed overseas for a short period of time, what some of the rules are and what some of the challenges are. And this is actually quite fluid because there's been literally some recent updates. So Gemma's going to take us through all of that. It's going to be a little bit different because when it comes to all of the new rules, I'm not really going to contribute very much to the discussion, but that's probably a good thing. So in terms of a Star Wars reference, as far as that bit goes, I'm going to do the Yoda. Do or do not. There is no try. I'm not going to try. I'm going to do not and let Jemma do the do. Okay. So I'm just laying the groundwork. I know that I got my Star Wars reference in, so I've ticked
that was a win.
So we're going to start. Why don't we start by laying the platform as to what the Australian government considers a foreign super fund, because that's kind of like the first step. Is it's got to be a recognised foreign super fund before we can even go down this path. So, Gemma, over to you. What jurisdictions are we talking about? What does the Australian government recognise as far as this goes?
So there's a definition of a foreign super fund that we often have to look at, and there's been some cases on it as well. One is Baker, which was looking at a US IRA or an individual retirement account, is that acronym. And so what they're talking about is whether it meets the definition of being like a super fund under the Australian rules, which is a provident benefit fund from that perspective, and generally considering the ability for people to access money prior to retirement, unless it's under the way that the Australian rules work. So the US is a prime example where the Australian foreign super fund definition doesn't apply, because you can access money if you are in the US prior to retirement for the acquisition of a house and things like that. So invariably, we generally talk about different rules that would apply to a foreign super fund, the US side of things. Most of the time when we're dealing with foreign super funds, we're talking about those that have come from the UK, or what I call UK light. So they might have been in the UK and have moved to a different jurisdiction to a recognised overseas pension scheme or ROPS in another jurisdiction, such as Guernsey or Gibraltar or the Isle of Man or Jersey, or Malta. They're the ones we tend to see, which I will call UK light, because the money has originated from the UK. There's also some other schemes that we encounter that are based in Bermuda, and they are the international area that some of the bigger mining companies in the world have. So Shell, BP, Chevron, to name a few, where they've got international employees. If they work in the UK under those banners, then they might have a UK based scheme, but if they work internationally, then they would have an international scheme over there. So they tend to sort of mirror the UK rules, but offshore. So again, those would meet the definition of being a foreign super fund. So mostly we're talking about those, and they meet the definition of a foreign super fund. And where that definition is met, it means that different provisions of the Income Tax Assessment Act apply to transfers from those funds. Where it's a non-foreign super fund, like a transfer from the US, it's taxed as a payment from a foreign trust. So you're basically looking at the amount that's paid across to the individual in Australia. What's taxable is effectively any increase in value from what was vested in that trust, which tends to be the value of the contributions over the life of the account. With a foreign super fund, where you meet that definition, so again, we're talking about UK or UK light sort of arrangements, then the way the provisions work is, high level, you only pay tax on the increase in value since you became a resident of Australia. So it's a different scenario from that perspective. So that's where the foreign super fund, that difference comes in from there.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and the tentacles I think are quite fascinating too. That you're not obviously only talking about one jurisdiction; you're talking about flow-on jurisdictions that
Mm.
obviously interact with I suppose the home base if you're talking about that. Now, there's some age restrictions too, aren't there, Gemma, with this? It's not just I go over there and I've contributed something and then I can just get that money back. There are all sorts of parameters that you've got to adhere to before you can even start this sort of action.
That's right. So from a UK perspective, so we used to be able to pre-2015, if regardless of your age, you used to be able to transfer your UK scheme to an Australian superannuation fund, and it didn't matter how old you were. So that was quite helpful, as long as the Australian fund was a qualifying recognised overseas pension scheme or a QROPS, then you could undertake that transfer. In 2015, they changed the rules, and you could only do that, access your pension scheme, including via an overseas transfer if you were 55. So you had to be pension age, unless the provisions in the international jurisdiction sort of mirrored the UK rules. And the issue with Australia was that under age 55, you can actually access your super on compassionate grounds and under financial hardship, which wasn't replicated in the UK. So you had to wait till pension age, which is currently 55, but it is going to move up to 57 soon. So once you get to 55 and you've got a UK scheme, which may have accumulated because you were Australian and you went over there and worked and then came back, or we encounter a lot of people that are expats. So they've come to Australia for work. They've worked for decades over in the UK, but they've also been in Australia for a number of years. They hit 55, and that's the first opportunity they've got to sort of access their UK scheme, and that includes via an international transfer to Australia, to Australian ROPS, recognised overseas pension scheme. So yeah, that age 55 is really important.
Now, again, we're talking about parameters and rules that you have to obey before you do this sort of stuff. It's not just a free-for-all to say that, oh, I've reached age 55 and I can sort of bring it all in and it doesn't really matter. It's fairly straightforward. Do people have an option between bringing it in as a lump sum or any other way, or are they dictated to as to the amount of money they can do in one transaction?
So there's that's a very open-ended question, Darin. So just wait, and then I feel for the listeners probably listening to my voice more in this podcast, particular podcast than usual. Anyway, so the consideration there is that there's really 2 to 3 ways that people can bring their money into Australia from these UK schemes. So now really just talk about those UK or UK light ones, but mainly UK is where there has been some changes. So you could start a pension. So there's the ability in the UK to either purchase an annuity, which is you lock in the income at the start and then you receive that regularly indexed over your lifetime, and then for that of a reversionary. So it's the same way that annuities work in Australia. A lot of people may already have that sort of fund in the UK to start with. So a lot of defined benefit schemes which have been set up by employers, they're still, not prevalent in the UK, but there's still a number of them that are out there, and particularly like the public sector. So NHS have them. If you work in the public sector, that's sort of the standard that applies, and some of the businesses or big companies have them as well. So you've got that option. You receive that regular income over your life, indexed each year. Now the tax position of that is so that's a pension. And also, so that's one option with a pension. The other is that you can receive what's called a flexible access drawdown, or a FAD. There's lots of acronyms here, so I'll apologise
Of
for that in
course.
advance.
We
Of
love
course, there's
acronyms.
acronyms, different
Yeah,
acronyms,
we love
and
acronyms.
we do love them. And the consideration, it's a FAD is similar to an account-based pension, so you can draw down as much or as you like, and there is no minimum, so you don't have to take a payment at all over the course of a year. So unlike our account-based pensions. Now, the reason for that from a UK perspective is that over the life of a pension scheme in the UK, there's no tax payable at the pension level. Unlike in Australia, where you pay tax at 15% along the way, and then once you hit pension phase, you move to 0% tax on the earnings at the underlying scheme level, but then you pay no tax on the drawdowns once you get to 60 in Australia. But in the UK, you pay no tax throughout the life of that scheme, whether you're accumulating or not. But any drawdowns you receive, so pension or annuity payments, are fully taxable in the UK. So that's where they have that difference. Now, from that perspective, when it is pension drawdown, so you can decide if you've got a FAD, whether it's a small amount you receive or a much higher amount. That's up to you. We then need to, so that would be fully taxable in the UK if you're in the UK. Now, if you're in Australia and you receive regular FAD payments or annuity/pension payments, then those are pension payments from a foreign fund, and those are also fully taxable in Australia. Now, there's a double tax agreement that also applies. So under the double tax agreement, Article 17 between Australia and the UK says that the country of residence has the taxing right with respect to those sorts of payments. So that would be that even though the UK would tax that if you were a resident of the UK, because of the double tax agreement, if you're a resident of Australia and you receive a pension, Australia has the taxing right. Now, so that's one option, is that you can either pick an annuity, which will be fully taxable at your marginal rate in Australia. You can receive flexible access drawdown payments or FAD payments, which should also be taxed like a pension and fully taxable in Australia. So that's sort of one option. So basically start a pension. Now, the alternative is to receive a lump sum. So a lump sum payment is, as it indicates, a lump sum is paid of a more chunky amount that comes across. Now, mostly that tends to happen and be transferred to super in Australia to the ROPs. So it goes from the UK scheme to the ROPs here, and the schemes in the UK are familiar with that sort of process, as opposed to transfers happening to the individual themselves. There's some exceptions to that, but generally you're talking transfer from the UK scheme to the scheme in Australia. Now, what's taxable then is the increase in value since you became a resident. So if you've got £1 million sitting in a UK scheme, and £500,000 of that represents the increase in value since you became a resident of Australia, to use nice big round numbers. Then if that account was transferred into super in Australia, so say a 100% transfer into a ROPS in Australia, then that £500,000 increase in value would be what's called the applicable fund earnings, or the growth component in Australia, and taxed and be subject to tax. Now, the default position on that transfer is that the individual pays tax on that in Australia at their marginal tax rate, which would be quite high, as you can imagine, on a £500,000 transfer. But if there's nothing left over in the source scheme when it's transferred into super in Australia, you can elect that the fund pays tax on that at 15%. So that's where the attractiveness of these is you transfer from the UK scheme into the Australian scheme. That increase in value since residency is taxed at 15% rather than your marginal rate. And also that's the sort of two lump sum options is individual pays tax or the super fund pays the tax, and that's generally a better outcome than paying tax on regular pension payments being fully taxable as well. So that's sort of how that flows out. Now, there are differences with that. And what we often encounter is, so again, what the UK is familiar with, if you're a UK resident, and we'd use my example, again, £1 million. So if I lived in the UK and I had £1 million, when I hit a retirement age, so I hit 55, I can start taking that out. I can access that money. Now, what is available in the UK is what is called a pension commencement lump sum, or wait for the acronym, PCLS. How innovative. And a PCLS is available to people who have a UK scheme, and you can take out up to 25% of your pension account tax-free. Now, that's UK tax-free, not Australian tax-free, just to be aware, because we often encounter this. So it's tax-free in the UK, and that means that in that example, it's £1 million and you can take out £250,000 tax-free. Now, the ability to, if you've got more than the UK's current, it's called the lump sum and death benefit allowance. That's a great acronym too. Used to be called the lifetime allowance, but that since the 6th of April 2024, there's been a change in the rules in the UK on that front, and the lifetime allowance itself has been removed. But we now have what's called a lump sum and death benefit allowance. So that limits how much you can take out as a pension commencement lump sum, so that people can't accumulate, millions of pounds and then access a quarter of it effectively tax-free from that perspective. So in the UK, if you're under your lump sum and death benefit allowance, you can take out a quarter tax-free up to that amount. Now, let's say that's the UK rule. So that UK rule of being tax-free in the UK applies if you're a UK resident or not. You can take out a quarter up to that lump sum and death benefit allowance. Now, the challenge that we encounter there is, let's say Jemma has moved into Australia some years ago. She's got her £1 million. £500,000 of that represents the increase in value since she became a resident. If Jemma's a tax resident of Australia, and she takes out what she thinks is tax-free, her quarter, £250,000, in the UK, that'd be tax-free. But in Australia, we've got to overlay the increase in value since Jemma became a resident, which we know is £500,000. And from that perspective, it's not proportionate. So it's not, well, half of the account represents the increase in value, therefore half of the 250,000 is taxable. It's sort of last in, first out. So the first amount of any payment that comes to me or to my super represents that growth. So if I've received £250,000 as a pension commencement lump sum, and my total £1 million has £500,000 of growth under the Australian rules in it, that £250,000 will be 100% taxable at my marginal tax rate in Australia. And people don't necessarily, there's a misalignment there because they think, it's 25%, often referred to as tax-free cash, tax-free in the UK, but not tax-free in Australia. So we need to be really careful on that front.
Yeah, this is amazing stuff, and it does make sense too that you're looking at the laws from obviously two different countries' perspectives, and you obviously have to get that right, because I'm assuming that being tripped up by them has got some pretty bad consequences associated with it. But you did mention, Jemma, the different tax treatments of if you just took it as an individual, like a personal lump sum, or you put it into your superannuation account, and obviously the different tax treatment, so much more tax effective to put tax effective to put it through super. I'm getting tongue-tied here. But of course, when you put it through super, there are other implications apart from tax that you would no doubt have to get your head around. So, for example, how does that work with your contributions caps? Because I'm assuming that would come in and be treated as a contribution. Is that right?
That's right. So certain elements of it, yes. So if you, again, I'll use my £1 million example. If that all was transferred into super in Australia with the intention of getting a 15% tax rate on the £500,000 of growth. So great. we can do that. We can make the election that the super fund pays tax on it. Now, we can only make that election if it's a 100% transfer from the source scheme. So that's the first criteria there to get the 15% tax rate. Now, the amount that's subject to that 15% tax rate, that doesn't count towards either of the contribution limits. So that's really quite good from that perspective. However, what does count is the value at my date of residency, that £500,000. So we've got £500,000 that's taxed at 15%, doesn't count towards any contribution cap. But then we've got £500,000 that is not subject to tax, but that actually then counts towards the non-concessional cap. So we've got to be really careful there, because my non-concessional cap could be anywhere between zero if I'm already over, if I've already used it in a prior year and I'm serving a bring forward period, or I've got more than $1.9 million in total super from the prior year. So it could be anywhere between zero and whatever the bring forward period happens to be at the time. So let's say I've got the full bring forward available, and I'm going to use 2 for 1 as my exchange rate because it's also easier for my brain. So I've got £500,000 or $1 million that is all of a sudden a non-concessional contribution within my ROPS as a result of that transfer. And so that is going to be in excess of my cap by, in the 23-24 year, $670,000. So then we have to overlay, how does that get dealt with under the non-concessional, excess non-concessional contribution provisions? So it's not a breach of the superannuation rules to have an excess contribution. There's integrity measures in place to prevent that, to disincentivize people making extra contributions. But the way that then works is, from an Australian perspective, the default position is that would be released from super. It'd be subject to associated earnings, and I know we've covered off on all excess non-concessional contributions in another podcast. So it'd be subject to associated earnings, which would apply from 1 July of the year of the contribution to when the tax office tells you to deal with it, which could be 18 to 24 months worth of associated earnings. And then that is taxed at my marginal tax rate, less a 15% offset, and an amount would have to be released from super. Now, the challenge with that is that if you release that amount from the ROPS, and it's a ROPS, so you've got, it's a ROPS under the UK HMRC regulates ROPSes. A ROPS regulates the ROPS, and if any payments are made from a ROPS, you've got to report them back to HMRC. And so you've got to make sure that the operation of the ROPS is done correctly, no different to the way a self-managed fund being regulated by the tax office operates. So any particular payments you need to report back to HMRC. So if a release occurred of an excess contribution from that ROPS, then that would be reportable back to HMRC. And in prior to more recent times, the challenge with that was that an authorised payment under the UK rules, or was it an unauthorised payment? And if it was an unauthorised payment, it could be taxed at up to 55% on the UK side, which you would not want, of course. So to mitigate any of the risks there, what would often occur is any transfer from the UK of a UK scheme into Australia, you would try to avoid that by making sure you didn't go over your non-concessional cap because of the way that worked. Now, how did we do that? So what we would do is, in the UK, we would split the scheme. So say I've got my £1 million. So we know that half of that represents the increase in value since residency, and the other half is the value of residency, basically. So what we would do is we would set up a second UK scheme, and we would then transfer to that, say, the £500,000 plus an amount up to the non-concessional cap, generally with a buffer. So let's say we move, £150,000 across as well. So we go from $1 million, we move $650,000 across to the second. It's called a SIP, which is a self-invested personal pension. Again, another great acronym. So we go from original scheme to SIP 2, let's call it, SIP 1 to SIP 2 of 650. Then SIP 2 comes into the ROPS in Australia. And because, like I mentioned earlier, it's last in, first out, the first £500,000 would be the growth or applicable fund earnings, and then the balance of the 150 would be treated as a non-concessional contribution. Because the scheme, that SIP2 transfer, ends up with a zero balance left, then you're able to elect for the super fund in Australia to pay tax on the growth at 15%. So that's how we used to do it. Now, that still leaves behind £350,000. So what happened then, there was various options then to deal with that on the basis that the growth had been stripped out and been taxed at 15% in Australia. One of those options was that you would serve out, you bring forward, and then do rinse and repeat, do it again. But that could then take some time to get that amount across into Australia. Now, one of the alternatives that we often did for our clients was that we would then look, because from an Australian tax perspective, there was then nothing left from a growth perspective in that account. We would then look to pay that to the person directly. So that would be in the form of, and you're going to love this acronym, Darin, you're going to love it. It's called an uncrystallised funds pension lump sum, or a UFPLS, or an UF plus. I love these acronyms. But again, people are probably shaking their head going, God, Jemma, you're such a nerd. And I'm like, sure am. Right. So we would pay to the individual as an UF plus, or an uncrystallised funds pension lump sum. Now, I mentioned earlier on about the double tax agreement and how that operates between the two jurisdictions. Now, with that, what happens is, it's not just a matter of putting your hand up and saying, well, I'm a resident of Australia, so don't withhold any tax on this because the double tax agreement applies. You always have to receive a payment out of a UK scheme and then once that first payment has been received, you can then apply for what's called a nil tax code through the tax office in Australia. That goes to HMRC. HMRC does their thing, and HMRC being the other acronym for His Majesty's Revenue and Customs. So HMRC would go, oh, yep, Jemma's a resident of Australia, stamp. So therefore, they would issue a nil tax code then to the scheme that paid the amount, and then any further payments from that scheme, there'd be no tax withheld. So that would need to occur if you're receiving an annuity or a FAD, and even with an uncrystallised funds pension lump sum. So with those, what we would generally do is, you don't want to pay. So what was left over after I did that first carve out was £350,000. You wouldn't just say, right, here's £350,000 into your bank account, Jemma, because the scheme in the UK without a nil tax code would withhold a lot of tax on that. As opposed to once a nil tax code was in place, though, that was a little bit different. Now, so what we would generally do is receive a small UF plus, get the nil tax code generated, and then look for the balance to be paid out. Now, that timing can take 6+ months and had been taking that long to get a nil tax code issued by HMRC. But once it was issued, then we'd look for that lump sum to be paid directly to the individual themselves. And because we'd already carved out the growth, then we were looking all good. The other thing is, again, I mentioned earlier that the double tax agreement applied to pensions. Now, is a lump sum or an UF plus a pension? So that's a very good question, and a question that we asked of HMRC. And I would say the royal we engaged a UK tax advisor to request confirmation of that approach from HMRC. This was some years ago. So because there's two different articles that could apply to an UF plus payment. One is the pensions article, if HMRC was comfortable that it was classified as a pension and fell under the pensions article, therefore they would say that Australia had the taxing right. Or there's the other income article, which I think is Article 23, which where the UK could reserve their taxing right over it. And then Australia would look to tax it as well, because it would be a lump sum from a foreign super fund. And if the UK withheld tax on that, then the Australia, you could claim that back as a foreign income tax offset, depending on the extent to which Australia would tax it. So anyway, that's a whole bunch. See, it's very complicated, this stuff. HMRC looked at that situation of you receive a small UF plus and then get nil tax code and then the balance, would the double tax agreement apply? And we were successful in HMRC considering that if it had been one UF plus, so if I'd received the 350 in one payment, there would have been a lot of withholding on that. And I would not be able to claim that tax back, because they would assert their taxing right. But if it was more than one, then they agreed that the pensions article would apply. So that was exceptional because it then meant that we could undertake that strategy. We were already receiving 2 payments because of the nil tax code, so it then allowed all of that to happen. But that is one of the areas that has recently changed, which I will discuss in a moment. So anyway, there's lots of different things here. Does that answer your question? I probably didn't.
Well, there's so much to unpack there. It's pretty amazing. I love the UF plus, and you're talking about getting concessional treatment if you have UF pluses rather than one
Yes.
plus. I feel that we need a whole run sheet of acronyms for this podcast because there are so many.
So many.
It's actually unbelievable, and I didn't realize that obviously the way you go with this, that some of the tax regime that you're talking about is actually extremely adverse for the individual. I mean, who wants to pay 55? I thought our top marginal tax rate was a big penalty. Who wants to pay 55%?
That's right. Yeah,
On a
exactly.
balance? I mean, that's a significant amount of money.
But a very good disincentive, hey, for people,
100%
Yeah.
it's a very good disincentive. I doubt anybody would be sticking their hands up to do that.
Yeah.
Now, of course, Jemma, you just quickly mentioned that there are some recent changes to some of these rules that you're going to take us through now, which means this is completely the area that I'm going to shut up about. And I'll let you talk
Let me
us through
go.
exactly what some of these changes are and what differences that they're going to make. And this is, of course, very, very recent.
Yes, it is. So a couple of things. So it's been an interesting area to be working in since, say, December last year, but even before then, because I mentioned very briefly the lifetime allowance that the UK had in place, and the standard lifetime allowance was £1,073,100, which sounds like a very arbitrary number, but it's probably not that different to back when we used to have RBLs. So that was an arbitrary number. And and again, a bit of history, sort of not really history, but background, during COVID, the issue in the UK was that a lot of doctors were hitting that lifetime allowance with respect to their pension accounts. And so once you get to your lifetime allowance, or got to your lifetime allowance, I mentioned earlier that pensions, you pay no tax along the way within a pension scheme in the UK, and then whatever you receive out is then taxable. Now, that is up to your lifetime allowance. If you start receiving an income stream or a pension out of your scheme and it's over your lifetime allowance, that gets hit with an extra 25% lifetime allowance charge. So there's not a huge incentive to go over your lifetime allowance. Now, there was some feedback on that was, well, why should if I'm a doctor and I'm in the NHS scheme, what's my incentive to continue to work within that scheme or continue to work and accumulate benefits in that if I'm going to be penalised when I start drawing that down in the future? So this isn't directly relevant to people who are in Australia, but it had that wider impact of going, oh, whoops, we're going to have to address this because we need these people to work we want them to remain in the workforce because, the health system, et cetera, et cetera. So as a result of that, a couple of years ago, it was proposed, and this applied for the last UK tax year. So from the 7th of April 2023 to the 6th of April 2024, where the lifetime allowance charge, that 25% I mentioned, was removed. So it meant that if you were over your lifetime allowance, you didn't get hit with that charge. So that was great. Now, they didn't get rid of the lifetime allowance itself because there was too many other benchmarks of that within the legislation. So since the 7th of April this year, we now have this new allowance called, so the lifetime allowance has effectively been rebranded to a lump sum and death benefit allowance, which is also a great acronym, and an overseas transfer allowance. So we had a year where there was no lifetime allowance charge, and that meant that if you could transfer your benefits from the UK into Australia, and if you were over your lifetime allowance, you wouldn't be hit with that charge on that transfer. So that was a win for those people. And now we've got a lump sum and death benefit allowance and this overseas transfer allowance. And so that's really a rebrand of what the lifetime allowance was before. So what that means is that if you receive a transfer from your UK scheme into Australia, into your Australian scheme, and you're over the overseas transfer allowance, which is the £1,073,100, then you will be hit with an overseas transfer allowance charge of the 25%. So that's new since the 7th of April, but it's no different to the situation prior to the 7th of April 2023, where if you're over your lifetime allowance, that same thing would apply. So we just had that 1 year where if you were over your lifetime allowance, that's what that looked like. So that's sort of one change that's come through. The other one is that I mentioned the HMRC had this interpretation regarding those payments, so that the double tax agreement, the pensions article of the double tax agreement would apply. So the pensions article applies to annuity payments and pension payments that I mentioned like very early on under a flexible access drawdown or an annuity. The pensions article would apply. Would be if you're in the UK, it's fully taxable at your marginal rate. Under the Australian provisions, we're talking fully taxable at your marginal rate. So it's very similar. Now, that's all straightforward. If you had your UF plus, 2 UF pluses, again, HMRC's view was that the pensions article would apply. Now, in December, we had some intel that HMRC was going to change that interpretation, and lump sum payments would no longer be eligible to fall under the pensions article. Now, this wasn't just in the context of Australians. This was in the context of a lot of expats who live in Europe. And so you can imagine the tax leakage from the UK to other countries where people are receiving lump sum payments. Now, the consideration there was it wasn't necessarily just UF pluses that were caught by this, but any irregular or ad hoc payments, say from a FAD, where 1 year you took out £10,000 and the next year you took out £100,000. It was all over the place. So it was the regularity. If it was regular, then you've got your pensions article applying. But if it was irregular, then you would be caught, and where the UK might then assert their taxing right under the other article. Now, each jurisdiction has got a different double tax agreement with the UK. Some of them do address lump sum payments. Australia's double tax agreement does not. So it either falls under the pensions article or the other income article. So from that perspective, we were advised, because this was just it wasn't official guidance, nothing released to the public, we were advised just, shot across the bow, just hold off any such payments, because even though we might have a nil tax code in place, that didn't stop HMRC from knocking on your door saying, "Oh, Jemma, you took out £350,000 as an UF plus. Well, that doesn't fall under the double tax agreement, so we're going to, recover our tax on that because it wasn't withheld." So we went, "Ugh, goodness me, and to wait to hear, because again, any irregular payments, that was a concern, even from a FAD, not just from an UF plus. Now, what is a regular payment? You could take £50,000 out annually, but because it's a one-off, does that mean it's not regular? And again, the consideration there might be, well, you'd have to look at the history of the account over a period of time, not just within an annual period, to see how much might come out, and some other comments about what's left over to provide for the ongoing sort of income stream over the life. So that was a concern for us. So then we had to pivot and think, right, okay, well, that's a challenge, because then that removes the ability to receive payments directly to the individual without some potential adverse UK tax implications. So then we were back to, okay, how do you do a transfer to super in Australia without falling foul of the non-concessional contribution provisions? Now, so that was what happened at the UK level with some changes. We also then had, so we've been involved in this area, and it sort of happened a little bit by accident. We had some clients that came to us with, we want to transfer our money, and we just, built on our knowledge and expertise in this area. And as a result, so this was, I think I did a presentation at the SMSF Association National Conference in 2016 on all these changes and things, so some time ago. And as a result of that, we spoke to some different clients and really tried to come up with a solution to get their money into Australia in the most efficient manner. So that was into super to them individually. So that's how this has sort of evolved over time. Now, we had also engaged a lot with the tax office on that, because I mentioned earlier that consideration of a FAD being potentially, treated as a pension under the Australian tax provisions, and so fully taxable. But the consideration there was where someone had taken a pension commencement lump sum, that 25%, so to take out 25%, so we use our £1 million. So if it was £1 million and I took out 250,000, to take out a quarter tax-free in the UK, I had to what's called crystallise 100% to take out a quarter. So by taking out £250,000 as a pension commencement lump sum, I crystallised £1 million. So then I'd have £750,000 left over in the UK that was crystallised. Now, the only way that you can then receive that crystallised amount into Australia is you can't take UF plus. You can only then either do a 100% transfer into super or receive FAD payments. So we explored the ability to receive a sort of final FAD or a one-off FAD, and whether the ATO would treat that as a pension and tax it fully, or they would consider that it was a lump sum for tax purposes in Australia, and therefore just apply that usual methodology of increase in value since residency / increase in value since last payment. And I appreciate this is very technical and very complicated. And I'm looking at Darin's face and he's going, holy Jesus. Jemma, why did I agree to talk to you about this topic? And I said it would be shorter, but I don't think that's going to be the case. Anyway, so we engaged with the tax office and applied for a private ruling on that front to say, well, there's precedent for it. The tax office has got their tax ruling out there about when a pension is considered to commence and cease. So that is helpful. That was helpful from that perspective. Now, that dealt with superannuation income streams, which is an Australian definition. So obviously that wouldn't apply to an international transfer because it's for Australian super. But then there was other precedent that was supportive of that. And we were successful in having that outcome come through, that the tax office considered that a final FAD would be treated as a lump sum for tax purposes. So that was a good win. So from that perspective, then we were able to make those transfers for those people that couldn't take an UF plus and had to receive a FAD. So there was that arrangement in place. So that worked out quite fine from that perspective. Now, but we had some rulings with the tax office on that front. So every time we had a client take a fad and we wanted to do it that way, we would apply for a ruling, because if the interpretation changed such that instead of it being eligible to be taxed as a lump sum, the interpretation was no, 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 it's a pension, then it was either fully taxable in Australia as a pension, or it could be completely tax-free in Australia because that increase in value was zero. From that perspective. So we had ongoing engagement with the tax office on that front. Now, we had a couple of clients where before they came on board and we looked at these sorts of transactions, a lot had happened in the UK with basically them exercising choice and moving their schemes across to different ones along the way since they became a resident. And the consideration with that was because you've got different calculations, and I'm not going to go into them too much because they're quite complex, is with certain transfers, but moving that growth into a super in Australia, if it wasn't fully cleared out, so I've used £1 million earlier, let's say my transfer from SIP1 to SIP2 was only £400,000, but my growth was 500, and I moved that 400 into Australia, which would all be taxed at 15%. What happened to the 100,000? Does that sort of get carried forward into the future? So we were asking questions on that because it was unclear in the legislation. Now, again, background, this legislation has been in place since 2004. And obviously since then we've had simpler super, and I use that massively in inverted commas, since 2007 came into place. And then we've had the better targeted superannuation concessions, which is basically the transfer balance cap provisions, total super balance and contribution provisions that came into play in 2017. But the 2004 rules only really transplanted from the 36 Act to the 97 Act in 2007, but they haven't really kept pace with what's been happening from the Australian rules back then. So the way that the legislation is drafted has got some quirks in the calculations. So we were asking so that's why it was a bit contentious as to whether that £100,000 got like disregarded or whether it would sort of be carried forward. So as a result of that, asking that question, as well as some other bits and pieces, we had a ruling with the ATO for some time because they were grappling with how all of this would work. Anyway, in discussions with them in December, it came to light that their interpretation of various things happening there, but overall how these transfers work and that increase, that the taxable amount in Australia, it's different to how the industry does it. And that's why we're having this special podcast here, Darin, and why in the next few weeks I'll be presenting for the SMSF Association, probably the Tax Institute and FAR on all of this, or the Financial Advisors Association of Australia, FAR, because it's an area where we've been aware of it since our engagement with the tax office on this, and it is the ruling that this applied to the client. It's about to be on the public database if it's not there already, and so it's important that people are aware of their active clients where they're moving this money across, and that's in progress, or those that they're advising, because the way that the calculation, the way that industry has done it historically is different to the tax office's renewed interpretation. And in our discussions with them, they will be applying that interpretation. So if I go back to, and the way that so I mentioned earlier that, you move the growth and then it comes into us, you move that into the ROPs in Australia. So we split the account and then it comes across. Now, the challenge with that then becomes the next time that might be split. So let's say instead of my UV plus strategy of a small UV plus and then the balance, instead I waited till the bring forward period was reset, and then I did another £150,000, say from SIP 1 to SIP 2, plus whatever I considered to be the growth of that account over that period of time, and move that into the ROPS in Australia. And that was on the basis that you sort of restart from scratch at the time that first payment happens, and it's only any growth from there that would actually be taxable in Australia. Now, the interpretation from that front has changed. So looking at that, you don't get that starting point. What happens is, if I was to move, so I had 350 to start with, if I was to move 150 into SIP 2, and then with the aim of moving that into the ROPS in Australia, and say my consideration is, well, what's in SIP 1 is all non-growth, and represents the balance left over of what was there at residency. So you're thinking, well, that's not going to be subject to tax. That's going to be a non-concessional contribution. Now, the way that this has changed is that if you have a look at the formula and the way that it works, and this is all in section 305.75 of the Income Tax Assessment Act 97, for those nerds out there like me. So if I moved 150 from the 350 across, and then that came into the ROPS in Australia, that wouldn't be all non-growth, because what determines what's taxable of that amount is what's left over in the other scheme. So if I move 150, what's left over is 200. So of the 150, 200 is actually what could be taxable, limited to the payment, which is 150. So instead of that 150 being a non-concessional contribution and not taxable in Australia, in this scenario, it's actually fully taxable. So that's a complete change to the way that the industry does this. Now, to further go on that front, so let's say I moved 200 from the 350 across. So what's left over is 150. So of the 200 that I then move into ROPS, what's taxable of the 200 is 150, because that's what's left over in the original one. So if I just go directly from my leftovers of the 350 into ROPS, then what's left over is 0. So that whole 350 actually goes into the ROPS in Australia. And that is because there was no leftovers, that would all be non-concessional. But if there was any increase in value, that would still be taxed. So it's a bit of a counterintuitive formula, the way that it works. And in our discussions with the Tax Council network at the tax office, they were alive to the fact that it is counterintuitive, and also contrary to the original intentions of this legislation back in 2004. However, that is how their job is not to write the law, their job is to interpret it. And this is where their interpretation has landed. So they, again, are alive to the fact that it's contrary to the intentions, contrary to the way that the industry has done it for a long time. And so they, in addition to putting out public guidance on how this all works. So obviously a private ruling, for those who've ever read anything from the private ruling database, they're very helpful sometimes, but when you can't see the numbers in there, because they're all not blacked out, but they're all X's, then it's very hard to get the gist of the calculations and how that falls out. So that's why, again, this is an important conversation to be having with people, because in the situation, so like I mentioned, that UF plus scenario. So if I've got 350 left over, and say the UF plus that I pay myself is £50,000, and I'm thinking, oh, well, that's not taxable in Australia because it's a lump sum, and what's left over here is all non-growth. But under this formula, that would all actually be growth, or the way that works, and fully taxable £50,000 at my marginal tax rate in Australia. Now, again, that's quite high level. There's two different subsections of that section that covers off on it. So that's really, again, challenging to have a look at. So this all sort of came about December where we had these first indications of both the HMRC position, the tax office position, and so we've sort of been pivoting and trying to get like things finalised in terms of how this is all going to work. And again, the tax office is aware that this is contrary to previous guidance and also the way that the industry does it. So they will be looking to apply a compliance approach to that. And what that looks like, we still await their guidance. But again, they're being very pragmatic from that perspective. So that's one element that's sort of been happening. So
So when you
I'm
talk about compliance, sorry, Jemma, when you talk about
yeah,
compliance approach, you're potentially looking at the tax office maybe applying some sort of amnesty in the interim, so that, again, you use the word reasonable. I think
mm.
whatever they do is more reasonable, and in the transition period, when everybody gets their head around this, you're not going to be up for like really severe penalties, which you could do.
Yeah, that's right. So, that compliance approach of no compliance resources will be allocated to an alternative calculation up until this point in time, which is what we're just waiting on. So in my example of that £50,000, let's say, or let's say I had my 350 and I decided to take a pension commencement lump sum on that 350. So that would then be, a quarter of that 350 that was left over. And I can't do that sum in my mind, like 82,500 or $87,500 pounds rather. So that £87,500, that would then under the previous approach would be considering that would be tax free in my own name. But if you apply this formula, it's actually fully taxable. So in light of that consideration, so we still await what that compliance approach looks like. Again, they've been very pragmatic on these sorts of things in our discussions with them. But the big thing for me is obviously the impact on my clients, where we're in the process of moving money from the UK,
Yeah.
and we changed it up in December, being alive to obviously what was going on in the UK, as well as this change of interpretation. How can we then, make sure that we're falling in line with all of those provisions? Then the other consideration with that was looking at, bringing this money over. How do we do it in the right way? Because breaking it apart isn't necessarily going to work. Or if we break it apart, we're going to pay more tax in Australia potentially on that, and what that all looks like. So again, the intention with this sort of special podcast was to make it shorter than usual, which I just appreciate we have not accomplished. And again, I can talk about some other bits and pieces that have arisen as a result of all of this, but I don't want to take up too much more of people's time on that front. The overall, because the other thing, that's come about is some confirmation and some intelligence from HMRC about the unauthorised or authorised treatment of the release of excess contributions, where that is an authorised payment, not an unauthorised payment. So that does make things a little bit easier to manage with a 100% transfer. So that has been helpful as well from that perspective. So from here, back to you.
Sorry,
Sorry, Darin.
I was just gonna ask you from our end, I suppose you're talking about the Australian legislative landscape, and nothing's changed there. So obviously, when strategizing getting money back from pension schemes overseas, the split was done for a strategic reason, right? And you explained that in the interaction with the non-concessional contributions caps and those sorts of considerations. Nothing's changed there, has it? So it's not
No,
like there's been a compensation just to say that, well, these rules in the UK have changed, so maybe we can allow some concessions here. Everything else has stayed the same, hasn't it?
that's right.
Which is
So,
what's thrown this into a little bit of turmoil, obviously.
well, yeah. So there's two elements here. One is a UK change in legislation, a UK we've had like draft guidance and a bit of intelligence there from HMRC that they're going to change their double tax agreement considerations. And then Australian legislation hasn't changed at all. It's the tax office's interpretation of that has changed to the extent that the way that the industry used to do it, or does it at the moment. So nothing else has sort of changed, but that is still a lot going on from that perspective. And what we want to avoid here, of course, is people paying excessive amounts of tax for money that they have sort of in good faith built up in the UK, and then they want to bring it into the country where they might have been living for decades and working, but they were under 55, and it's where they intend to live forever and retire here. So, and again, I remember in initial discussions with the tax office, they would say, well, we don't really understand why you are splitting it apart and why you're trying to do this. And then it was like, well, because of the excess contribution provisions and the risk from an HMRC perspective. And they're like, oh, okay. So trying to maneuver between all the jurisdictions and a lot of puzzle pieces going on, it was challenging then, and it still remains to be seen, remains that way. So really the point of today and these other sessions coming up is that education approach, because again, we're aware of this because we've been in consultation with the tax office on several matters and about how all of that works. So we're aware of that, and we were fortunate enough that our contact in the UK indicated, and they said, don't make any more of these payments because something seems to be afoot. And so we've sort of limited what's been happening there. So we've been fortunate that we've had that intel coming through, but now I think it's important that everyone's aware of it, because if you're in this space, and it might be that you are advising clients on these transfers, or that you're the administrator of the ROPs and picking up these transfers, or you have a client who says, oh, so Jemma, how do I've got this money in the UK, how can I bring it over? And you're like, Barley's, no deal. But then you're aware, and you can then at least perhaps talk about it. So that was really the motivation to having this sort of special one where I did lots of talking and everyone's sick of my voice.
It sounds like a really relevant thing to be on people's radars. If I could borrow a Bart Simpson term, ay caramba, it sounds like it's really, really complicated, and almost to the extent when you were explaining it and going through it, it's almost like we've got to a point where you've got to choose right now the best bad option to get a resolution.
Yes, but because of the way that this is all sort of transpired, is that there's still perfectly fine mechanisms to get the money over. It's just being aware of how that works now, and trying to get the best outcome. And there might be not as tax effective as what it used to be, but it still is highly efficient than generally receiving a regular pension from your UK scheme on an ongoing basis. So you can still get a good tax outcome, the capital into Australia within a shortish period of time. There's some timing considerations with all of that, but it will generally be a better tax outcome than the alternative option, which is regular pension over time.
Yeah. Now, just slightly earlier, you mentioned that you're going to go into this in a lot more detail. You've got some webinars coming up. One is for the SMSF Association, one's for the Tax Institute, and I think one's for the new merged advice entity, the FAAA. Can you give us some detail as to when you might be presenting those webinars, just so that it can be on people's radars, and they can probably get their head around more of the detail as to these changes?
So the SMSF Association one will be on the 9th of May, So that it's going to be at, I've got to get my timing right. I think it is 4 p.m. Eastern. On the 9th of May, and we're just landing on the details for the Tax Institute and for FAR at the moment. Now, with those ones, the intention is that they occur prior to 30 June because I feel like we're a hop, skip, and a week away from 30 June, and just making sure that where, say, the compliance approach the tax office says, the tax office comes up with is, say, any transfers that occur before 30 June 2024, we won't put our resources behind, then obviously wanting to get our skates on if that's the situation. So it can take some months to actually get these pension transfers happening from a UK perspective. Everything takes a long period of time. So it's worthwhile people being aware. And if you're advising clients where they might be doing the transfers in the new year, at least you're aware of then what that needs to look like, because it might change up the way that happens and that advice. So it's really just an awareness education consideration. And that's why I'm sort of doing this. I mean, all of us, we want to get the best outcome for our clients. And so again, that's really where the basis of this has come from.
Wow, Gemma. And again, I don't think we can ever use the word simplest super anymore because
No,
everything we talk about is infinitely
far from it.
complicated for both you, the practitioners, and the trustees themselves. But that was really great, Gemma, and obviously really timely. So without going into further detail, I think we'll probably wrap it up there for this session. But that was really good, and as I said, really on the forefront of what's going on, and it's going to be a matter of people getting their skates on to try and get their heads around this and implement new sorts of strategies to get the optimal outcomes for their clients. So the only thing that's left is to thank you for going through all that technical detail today, Gemma. You certainly bore the brunt of the burden of this podcast. So thanks very much. It was really good and really informative.
Well, thanks for again having me, Darin, and allowing me to to talk a lot. I know that I often do. I don't mind talking, but this one was particularly Jemma heavy. And I again apologise in advance. Well, it's not in advance. If you're at this end of the podcast, you've already listened to probably more than an hour's worth of content. So I apologise again for it going over the intended period of time. But I think it was important. If you're listening to this, you're obviously in the space and needing to be aware of what these changes are. So again, thank you for taking the time to listen.
I think I'm going to have to go away and do a special session by myself just to get my head around all those acronyms that you threw up at me. My head's sort of swimming as far as that goes at the moment. But
Yeah,
that's the
lots
world
of
we
them.
live in, isn't it?
Sure is. We love a good acronym. The longer, the better, it
Absolutely.
would appear as well.
Absolutely. So, look, on that note, thanks again, Gemma, and I want to thank all of you for being with us today on this episode of the Cross Country Super Podcast. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we've enjoyed bringing it to you. And don't forget, if you're accessing this podcast on our YouTube channel, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel as well. And until then, we'll see you on the next Cross Country Super Podcast. Thanks, everyone.